I'm very pleased to follow Prabhat for two reasons. One, he talked about a way forward, and I hope to say a little bit on that subject towards the end of my presentation today. And he also mentioned John Maynard Keynes, who I think is certainly second fiddle, or perhaps further down than Marx, but I think someone still very important and worth thinking about and talking about at this conference. I want to start with maybe a series of stylized facts. We had in the mid to late 2000s, of course, the financial boom that was tied up with the real estate market, among other kinds of financial products created and delivered to the market. We had the financial bust beginning in 2007, of course, the big collapse in late 2008, followed by the fiscal crisis of the state. Certainly we see it at the state and local level in the United States. We see it at the national level in Europe today. And then followed by, of course, fiscal retrenchment. Austerity, as Prabhat discussed, in Europe, but also, of course, in the United States, if anyone was watching the news last night, and the joy that President Obama, I think, seemed to have at cutting the largest dollar amount from the United States budget in history. One can see that austerity has become quite mainstream. But even what we might think being a rather extreme version of this, the kinds of things that have been going on in Wisconsin, and to a lesser extent Ohio, and other kinds of places down the road. Attacks on state workers in particular as part of a larger austerity project. I think those are not very controversial laying out of the facts of the last 10 years or so. The interpretation that I think is prevalent is that we are now in a position of a rather old story of capital organizing itself and attacking the working class. I want to submit today that that is not just a wrong interpretation, but I think it's also a problematic one for people like us at this conference, because what I think is going on is something somewhat different. And I think to try to understand how it is different, and hopefully understanding that can provide us with some kind of way forward. So I want to take a step back to begin my remarks. In the 1990s, we certainly saw in the United States a change in government spending that became increasingly correlated with the success of finance. If one can take a look at this simple chart, this is United States federal government expenditures and receipts in real terms from the end of World War II up until the very end of 2010. Up until the 1970s, these things moved together fairly closely. We have, of course, the Reagan deficits in the 1980s. But the two, I think, most important points are the giant dips right after the year 2000 and right after the year 2007 towards the end of this chart. Tremendous booms in receipts off of the success of finance, tremendous busts in receipts off of the failures of finance. Before financialization in the 1990s, and I would differentiate financialization from neoliberalism. They're certainly related, but I don't think they're the same thing. We saw fairly short falls in receipts in recession times, and they were fairly shallow. And so even when we did see deep declines, for example, in the late 1940s, the mid-50s, the mid-1970s, they were at least fairly short declines in revenues. And so the fiscal crisis, if you will, of the state was something quite different in those days. After the tech bubble pop in 2001, this was the fourth largest, steepest decline in relative terms in post-World War II US history, but it was also the longest. It was 16 quarters before United States federal government revenues returned to where they were before the crash. Now, today, 2007 to the present, we have had the steepest decline in relative terms in post-World War II United States history, over 15% decline in real revenues. And it is also the longest. We now in America get the worst of both worlds. We get the steepest declines and the longest periods of recovery. And I think this is intimately connected to our increasing dependence on finance to supply revenues to the state. What we saw in 2008, the TARP bailout is probably the best symbol of it, is what I would call a union of capitals. Finance capital, but coming together with other forms of capital, human capital, social capital, cultural capital. All, or at least most, of the good liberals in the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives voted for the TARP. Remember, the TARP wouldn't have passed if it wouldn't have been for the Democratic Party, who opposed the TARP, who opposed the bailouts, what I will call a Republican class. And I put this in scare quotes, and because I don't mean it to attach distinctly to the Republican Party, but to a much larger historical tradition in the United States that at least thinks of itself as a Republican, small r, movement. It's a petty bourgeois class, small business, but I think it is also what I would call an established white working class. That said, we are willing to take the risk. Let capital collapse. We believe in markets, said this group, and we don't think that the market will fail, even if finance does. What happened, of course, is that finance capital and human capital combined to save finance, to bail it out, and to stabilize the economy. As Dick Bryan and others have pointed out here at this conference this weekend, finance has returned to strength. Finance is doing just fine today. But few others in the United States are. Of course, we are in the worst employment recession in the United States since the 1930s. But back in the 1930s, this predicament did not stand. Finance was blamed for the crisis in the 1930s. Keynes gave a theoretical understanding of how it happened and blamed finance directly. Finance largely self-immolated in the 1930s, and what was left was imprisoned, quite frankly, by the state, within the nation-state. Nothing like that has happened today. Why not? I think because there's a very different kind of class politics going on in the United States today. We have a fiscal crisis of the state. And this is just a little bit of data to demonstrate that. This is estimates of the fiscal year 2011 budget gap in various United States states. These are expected. The fiscal year will end at the end of June of this year. Something like 40 United States are going to face fiscal budget deficits that have to be closed in some manner or another. You see California over there on the right-hand side, about 21%. Nevada, Illinois, New Jersey, these are tremendous sized budget deficits that in some way have to be closed. So what's the solution? The solution that we see from the Democratic Party is what I would call the soak the rich strategy. Personally, I don't have any moral qualms with soak the rich, but I do have political qualms with soak the rich, and essentially leave everybody else's taxes the same. This is what President Obama says all the time. No one will face a tax increase in America except the super rich on the top. Well, who are these people? In the states, these are the top 5 states that have very high marginal tax brackets, millionaires' taxes, if you will. That's what it's called in New York, which is just across the border from where I live in Massachusetts. California has a millionaire's tax. It starts at the top bracket at $1 million. These other 4 states, as you can see, are at $500,000. And the top marginal tax rates there are on the right-hand column. This is, I think, characteristic of a soak the rich essentially strategy. Find people who have a tremendous amount of money and tax them at the highest levels of anyone in the society. If you look at this list of states, these 4 of them appear also on this chart, which is the percentage of state general revenue supplied by the top 1% of individual income tax filers. This is an amazingly small number of people. And yet, as we can see, these 5 states are getting a pretty significant amount of their revenue from a tremendously small number of people. And at the very top of the list is California. Almost 13%, at least in 2007, before the crisis, of California's general revenue came from the top 1% of individual income tax filers. And then as we see on the list, right, those states that are here, soak the rich strategy, it works to some degree. At least it certainly does work in times that are flush. What I think we see now is a recommendation of this soak the rich strategy is that we should, in fact, states in the US should increase their reliance on the super rich, which in the United States today is functionally increasing the state's reliance on finance. Continue, essentially, the compensations of super inequality in the United States. What makes us believe that this is a practical political strategy? The United States government just saved finance, made it even stronger, I would argue, and now we think that we somehow through the state have the power to tax it. I think that is naive, and I think the political evidence today suggests the same. And I will also note that this is a very long way from what we might call a social democratic strategy, where everybody is brought into the tax system at, quite frankly, rather high rates. One might see a 50% income tax rates in some of the social democracies in Europe, VAT taxes of some 18% on sales. This is so far away from what any mainstream political movement in the United States today is proposing, and I think it is important to see that difference. But I think there's also a political problem, not just apart from the power of finance, but also the interests of the American people. This, or at least the expressed opinions of the American people. This is a result of a Gallup poll from February of this year, and the question was, which strategy do you prefer to close these tremendous budget gaps that we see in the US states? The least popular is increasing state sales, income, or other taxes. Only 27% of Americans in this poll supported increasing taxes. At least there was rough equality between reducing or eliminating state programs and somewhat close in reducing pay or benefits to government workers. And if we look at this same poll divided by political party, we see that Republicans, no surprise, would like to eliminate state programs, least interested in increasing taxes. But look at the Democrats. The Democrats are basically the same. About 33 to 35% for, about 60% against every strategy. Don't want to reduce any state program spending, don't want to cut anybody's salaries, and don't want to raise any taxes either. And I think this is a pretty serious political predicament, which I think is no surprise why the Democratic strategy, therefore, is essentially soak the rich. Well, I think since 2010, we have seen what I would call the Republicans' revenge, and Republican in particular the way I've been talking about it today, this Republican class is a petty bourgeoisie and an established white middle class. If raising taxes is not going to happen in the United States, the alternative has got to be cutting spending. And what I think we see in Wisconsin today is really just the beginning, right? Ohio has already followed in Wisconsin's footsteps. It's coming, I believe Indiana has already done it as well. It's coming in places like Florida, in Maine, in Michigan. Why these attacks on state workers, not just in terms of their salaries, but in terms of their ability to organize and bargain collectively? Well, to some degree, I think there is a good argument that it's an attempt by Republicans, and that is the Republican Party, to defund the Democratic Party, to eliminate a funding source from unions. But I think it is also a class strategy of attacking the professional class, at least to some important degree. What we can see in this chart is the percentage of workers in various large occupational categories and to what degree they are covered by unions. Number one, both in terms of percentage and in terms of absolute numbers, are professionals. The professional class is significantly a unionized class in America, at least as far as unions go in America, which today is, I think we all know, not very far, at least not certainly as far as it used to go. But if we look at this chart, the most unionized occupations in the United States, at least among large occupations that I arbitrarily drew a line at least 200,000 people in the United States work in this occupation. All of them, the top, top 7 occupations are all associated with the state. Postal workers, teachers, firefighters, police, bailiffs, people in the prison system, etc. So where I think we see the biggest pushes against state workers, and particularly state worker unions, are in states that, one, have very high rates of public employee unionization or collective bargaining rights for all public employees. Many states like Texas are not going to attack public workers because they don't have any bargaining rights anyway. They've already taken everything that they can take away. The second is having very large budget deficits that need to be closed. And the third is Republicans in power across the board. And that's important, I think, for us to remember that Wisconsin, we might think of it as a blue state, and yet Wisconsin has a Republican governor, a Republican state house, a Republican state Senate, and a majority of its representatives to Washington also being Republicans. Is this political suicide, though, for the Republican Party and perhaps, by my definition, this Republican class? This is, I think, what Democrats are hoping in a place like Wisconsin. They want to try to recall the governor, Scott Walker. But if we compare Scott Walker to his compatriot just south of the border in Illinois, Pat Quinn, I think we see some interesting numbers. Scott Walker has an approval rating today of 43% versus 54% opposed. That's not terribly bad considering how amazingly aggressive Scott Walker has been, how close his election victory was just a couple of months ago, and yet still 43% of the residents of Wisconsin support Scott Walker and his efforts. Pat Quinn, the Democrat in Illinois, has a 31% approval rating, quite a bit lower than Scott Walker's. What's Pat Quinn done to deserve this? He's raised taxes. He's raised personal income tax rates in Illinois from 3% to 5%, and he raised the corporate tax rate from 4.8% to 7%. Yes, Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, his negatives have skyrocketed, but his positives have remained fairly high considering how partisan, how aggressive he has been. I think professionals are especially vulnerable if they're going to rely on a plan of soak the rich, because professionals are dependent on the state in a way that this Republican class that I'm discussing is not. I think the professional class has as an ideology an appeal to merit or meritocracy. What the professional deserves is not to be determined in the market, but by other experts. And so therefore there needs to be an institution which can recognize expertise apart from the market. That tends to be the state or institutions that are heavily supported by the state. And professionals don't have enough power, as I think we've seen, to carry out a larger strategy other than just simply don't raise my taxes. The Republican class, I think, is much more autonomous from not the state overall, I certainly wouldn't make that argument, but from direct state spending. This is a class that is dependent much more on the market than on the state. And importantly, it has an ideology. And that ideology is, I think, laissez-faire. The Republican class believes the market works. And so how is it possible that finance could bring capitalism to the very brink, and yet people blame the state for it? Because the state saved finance. And the state is therefore responsible, in the view certainly of this class, of what happens next. The political question I think that we face today is the question that Lenin asked. Kto kogo? Whom? Who is over whom? Who will discipline whom? Who will defeat whom? I think the strategy of soak the rich is a bad one. At best, it merely perpetuates the status quo and all of its contradictions. At worst, it gives us all an incentive to preserve the health of finance, to continue financialization, and amazing levels of inequality. We need the super rich to support funding of the state. I think the only way forward is the way, as Prabhat discussed a little earlier, Keynes's way forward. By all means, let finance be national. The only, I think, comprehensive goal is to discipline, or rediscipline, if you will, finance. This would include things at the global scale, the kinds of things that people like Joe Stiglitz are talking about in terms of eliminating the United States dollar as a global currency and bringing finance increasingly under the power of the state. But also and also recognize the costs of that the United States will not be a country that can consume nearly as much as we consume today. And I think Stan Robinson's comments from yesterday are very appropriate to consider, that economic growth, at least so far, has been inextricably tied to the destruction of the natural environment. And so therefore, there are costs from definancializing an economy. Finally, at a more local or domestic scale, and I think my time is just about up, to build a broad, or at least a broader coalition, I think there are a couple of things we need to do. The first is to recognize that the professional class is not the font of virtue and goodness. We're self-interested too. We have a form of capital. We call it human capital, and we contribute to inequality by trying to have higher wages and higher benefits than others. In fact, one might say we need inequality just to exist as experts, but also to appeal to a much broader set of interests. And by this, I point to, I think, the very good article in the Rethinking Capitalism newsletter that Bob Meister wrote, thinking about this relationship between debt and taxes. Appeal to the interests of the middle class, so-called, in the United States, to avoid or to escape debt, educational debt, medical debt, perhaps even mortgage debt, although that one is probably so sacred a cow it would be difficult to tackle. What Bob said in that newsletter that if you haven't taken a look at, I encourage you to read. He said, to understand the role that capital markets play in the democratic politics of states like California, and I think this would go nationally, we have to compare how much in taxes people could afford to pay if they had no debt service, and how much more debt they could take on if they paid no taxes. This question is the kernel of the struggle over privatization and its relation to public values. I think this is potentially a way forward, to talk in this language in a very concrete way of debt and taxes. We certainly have a political ideology that is rampant in the United States, that all forms of taxes are bad. And not so much to raise the prestige of taxes, but to do it in a way that compares it to debt. And the dangers of debt that I think more and more people see, not just in their own households, but also in the fate of the state. Thank you.